In 1980, Pedro Medina was just 19 years old when he escaped Cuba on a rickety boat, part of 125,000 refugees fleeing Castro's regime. He thought he was sailing toward freedom. He had no idea he was heading toward a different kind of nightmare. 17 years later, on March 25, 1997, Pedro would become the center of one of the most horrific execution failures in American history. But here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. What happens when the system designed to deliver justice becomes the very thing it's supposed to prevent? Cruel and unusual. And what if the man strapped to that chair was telling the truth all along? Welcome to Criminal Tapes True Crime. We're going to cover everything about Pedro's crime, legal process, final meal, and last words. So stay locked in. Don't forget to like and share this video. Hit the subscribe button to be the first to know when we publish related videos. It's 5 a.m. on March 25, 1997, and Pedro Medina has exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes left to live. Not because he's sick, not because of an accident, but because the state of Florida has scheduled his death for 7:10 in the morning. For 15 years, Pedro has been playing the ultimate game of chess with the system. Is he genuinely mentally ill, talking to Albert Einstein and his alleged victim? Or is it all an elaborate performance to avoid the electric chair? The courts have decided he's sane enough to die, but in less than 3 hours something went so catastrophically wrong that forced America to ask a fundamental question. How do we kill people humanely? This is the story of how a botched execution changed America's conversation about the death penalty forever. Let's rewind to 1980. Picture this. You're 19 years old, and you've just made the most dangerous decision of your life. You're crammed onto a boat with strangers, leaving everything you've ever known behind. Pedro Medina was one of 125,000 Cubans who risked everything during the Mariel boat lift. Castro had opened the floodgates, and desperate families seized their chance at freedom. For Pedro, America wasn't just a destination. It was salvation. Pedro landed in Orlando, where his half-sister had already built a life. Think about that culture shock. From communist Cuba to Reagan's America overnight. New language, new rules, new everything. Next door lived Dorothy James, a 52-year-old gym teacher who had that rare gift. She saw people, really saw them. When she met this young Cuban refugee struggling to find his place, she did what teachers do best. She helped. Dorothy became Pedro's bridge to American life. She was patient, kind, the neighbor who'd check on you. But here's the cruel irony that'll haunt this entire story. Sometimes the people who save you become the ones you're accused of destroying. Some stories change everything. This is one of them. Dorothy James wasn't just any gym teacher. She was the kind who remembered every kid's name, who stayed after school to help the shy ones find their confidence. At 52, she dedicated her life to building up others. When Dorothy met Pedro next door, she saw what she always saw: potential. Here was this young man barely speaking English trying to navigate a completely foreign world, so she did what came naturally. She invited him over for coffee, helped him with paperwork, became the American friend he desperately needed. April 4, 1982, a neighbor noticed Dorothy hadn't picked up her mail. When police entered her apartment, they found a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Dorothy had been gagged, stabbed multiple times, and left to die in her own home. The very place where she'd shown kindness to a stranger had become her tomb. 4 days later, 200 miles away at a rest stop on Interstate 10, a highway patrol officer found someone sleeping in Dorothy's car. It was Pedro Medina. What started as a simple auto theft case quickly became something much darker. When Orange County detectives arrived to question Pedro about Dorothy's murder, his story kept changing. How did he get the car? Why was he so far from Orlando? His explanations just didn't add up. The evidence painted a damning picture. Pedro's hat was found on Dorothy's bed near her body. A knife was discovered in her car, though it couldn't be proven as the murder weapon. Then there was the bizarre attempted sale in Tampa Pedro trying to sell Dorothy's car for $250, getting into a fight with the potential buyer. When Pedro finally testified, he made stunning admissions. Yes, he had been in Dorothy's apartment that night. Yes, he was there when she was dead. Yes, he took her car afterward. But murder? That he denied completely. While awaiting trial, something disturbing started happening to Pedro Medina. Guards found him eating his own feces. He'd talked to empty corners of his cell for hours. They put him on suicide watch after he tried to harm himself. Now here's where this case gets really complicated. Was Pedro having a genuine mental breakdown, or was this all an elaborate act? Think about it. In Florida, you can't execute someone who's legally insane. Pretty convenient timing for a psychotic break, right? The court ordered 2 separate psychiatric evaluations. Both doctors reached the same conclusion. Pedro met the legal criteria to stand trial, but they suspected he was faking his symptoms. They called it malingering, basically putting on a show to avoid the death penalty. The judge agreed. Pedro Medina was competent to stand trial. But here's what makes this so heartbreaking. What if everyone got it wrong? Consider the cultural barriers Pedro faced. He was a Cuban refugee who barely spoke English, thrust into an American legal system he couldn't possibly understand. The trauma of leaving everything behind, the stress of being accused of murdering his only friend, wouldn't that break anyone? Guards reported that Pedro would have long conversations with people who weren't there. Albert Einstein was apparently a regular visitor. So was Dorothy James herself. Pedro would apologize to her, explain his innocence, beg for her forgiveness. But the experts saw performance, where Pedro's family saw pain. They saw manipulation, where others saw a mind fracturing under impossible pressure. The question that haunted everyone: how do you tell the difference between genuine madness and desperate theater when someone's life hangs in the balance? March 15th through 18th, 1983. 4 days that sealed Pedro Medina's fate. The prosecution had a straightforward case: physical evidence, admissions, and a dead teacher who'd shown nothing but kindness. Against his lawyer's advice, Pedro took the stand. Through an interpreter, he maintained his innocence, but his testimony was devastating. He admitted being in Dorothy's apartment that night. He admitted being there when she was already dead. He admitted taking her car and driving to Tampa. The jury heard a man who was either telling a partial truth or crafting an impossible story. How do you explain being in someone's apartment when they're murdered, but not being the murderer? The verdict came swift: guilty of first-degree murder. But the real decision was yet to come. By a vote of 10-2, the jury recommended death. The judge found 2 aggravating factors outweighed the single mitigating circumstance of Pedro's mental state. Pedro's lawyers immediately appealed, focusing on his mental illness. The Florida Supreme Court ordered another competency hearing, but the result was the same. Pedro was deemed sane enough to die. In 1983, Pedro Medina was transported to death row in Stark, Florida. He would spend the next 14 years waiting for a date with Old Sparky. Imagine spending 15 years in a 6x9 concrete box, knowing that every day could be your last. That was Pedro Medina's reality from 1982 to 1997. Over 5,400 days of waiting to die. Pedro's world shrunk to the size of a parking space. 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. 1 hour for exercise in a slightly larger cage. Meals pushed through a slot. Human contact measured in minutes, not hours. But the conversations with the dead never stopped. Guards would find Pedro talking animatedly to his cell wall, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in broken English. Albert Einstein remained a frequent visitor, along with Dorothy James herself. His lawyers never gave up, filing appeal after appeal. Each one focused on the same question: was Pedro mentally competent when he committed the crime? Was he competent now? The courts kept saying yes, but the evidence kept suggesting otherwise. Death row changes people. Some find religion, others lose their minds completely. Pedro seemed to exist in both worlds, lucid enough to maintain his innocence in perfect detail, yet detached enough to have full conversations with people who'd been dead for decades. Guards who worked with Pedro described him as polite but strange. He'd ask about Dorothy James like she was still alive, wondering if she was okay, if she forgave him. The cultural isolation made it worse. He was one of the few Spanish speakers on a predominantly English-speaking death row. Through it all, Pedro's story never changed. "I am innocent," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. Not "I was crazy" or "I don't remember." Just innocent. For 15 years, that was his truth. By March 1997, Pedro's lawyers were down to their final cards. They filed emergency appeals arguing that 15 years of documented mental illness proved Pedro was legally insane, and Florida law is crystal clear. You cannot execute an insane person. The evidence was compelling. Decades of eating feces, conversations with dead physicists, suicide attempts. But prosecutors fired back with their original argument. It was all an act, a 15-year performance to cheat death. Monday, March 24th, less than 24 hours before the scheduled execution, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered the final blow. Petition denied. No stay, no last-minute reprieve. Pedro Medina would die as scheduled. At Florida State Prison, officials began their grim preparations. Old Sparky was tested. Witnesses were notified and the media circus began. This wasn't just another execution. Pedro's case had drawn national attention because of the ongoing questions about his sanity. Prison officials were confident in their procedures. They'd executed dozens of inmates without major incident. What could possibly go wrong? March 25, 1997. Pedro's last meal was a feast fit for a celebration, not an execution. Delmonico steak with onion gravy, French fries, salad, black beans and rice, American cheese, butter pecan ice cream with strawberry topping, coconut cream pie, and a Pepsi to wash it all down. His final visitors included family who'd flown in from Miami and his spiritual advisor, Reverend Glenn Dixon. Pedro spent hours talking with Rev Dixon, not about salvation or forgiveness, but about his innocence. Even now, facing death, his story never wavered. Pedro spent his final hours writing letters and preparing his last statement. 3 simple words that had defined 15 years of his life. I am still innocent. No dramatic speeches, no pleas for mercy, just the truth as he saw it. The prison routine was methodical. Final shower, final phone calls to family, final meeting with his lawyer. Each final bringing him closer to 7:10 a.m. Meanwhile, technicians prepared old Sparky. They attached the electrodes, tested the circuits, and made one fatal decision. They replaced the natural sea sponge that conducted electricity with a synthetic one. It seemed like a minor detail at the time. Witnesses began gathering, media representatives, prison officials, Rev Dixon, and a few others. They expected to witness justice being served. None of them were prepared for what they were about to see. At 7:00 a.m., Pedro began his final walk. Shackled but dignified, he moved slowly down the corridor that connected his cell to the electric chair. 10 minutes to live. 7:10 a.m., March 25, 1997. Pedro Medina spoke his final words. I am still innocent. The warden gave the signal. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Pedro's body, and then everything went horribly wrong. I saw flames rising out of his head, orange and blue flames, 6 to 10 inches high. The smell was acrid, terrible. Smoke filled the entire chamber. The synthetic sponge, that seemingly minor substitution, had caused an electrical fire. Instead of conducting electricity smoothly, it created resistance, heat, and ultimately flames, shooting from Pedro's head like a human torch. Witnesses watched in horror as thick white smoke obscured their view. Red Dixon later testified he saw Pedro take 3 labored breaths after the current was turned off. Patricia McCusker, a prison official, saw his hand tighten, his chest move, but the autopsy told a different story. The medical examiner found that Pedro's death was instantaneous. The first jolt of electricity had caused massive depolarization of the brain, like turning the lights off. The apparent breathing? Just muscle contractions from a brain stem that hadn't gotten the message yet. Prison officials scrambled to control the narrative. Unintentional human error, they called it. A quick, humane death despite appearances. But the images were already burned into witnesses' minds, and soon the world's. Within hours, Pedro Medina's botched execution was front-page news across America. The official investigation concluded it was unintentional human error, that synthetic sponge had turned a routine execution into a nightmare. Medical examiner Bel Amojera insisted Pedro died a very quick, humane death with no evidence of pain and suffering. But tell that to the witnesses who watched a man's head catch fire. The public reaction was swift and divided. Death penalty opponents called it barbaric torture. Supporters argued it was a tragic accident that didn't change the justice of Pedro's sentence. But everyone agreed this looked nothing like humane execution. In 1999, death row inmate Thomas Provenzano filed a petition arguing Florida's electric chair constituted cruel and unusual punishment. His lawyers cited a disturbing pattern: Pedro Medina's flames, Jesse Tafero's head catching fire in 1990, and Alan Lee Davis bleeding from his face in 1999. The court recommended replacing the problematic lead leg piece with a more conductive brass electrode, a simple fix that might have saved Pedro from becoming a human torch. Pedro's execution became a symbol of everything wrong with capital punishment. The case that started with questions about his sanity ended with questions about our humanity. Pedro Medina's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice in America. Here was a Cuban refugee who escaped one authoritarian system only to be consumed by another, a man whose mental illness was dismissed as performance art. A case where cultural barriers may have sealed a death sentence. Think about the systemic failures. A traumatized immigrant who barely spoke English, thrust into a legal system he couldn't understand. Mental health evaluations that prioritized legal competency over human suffering. A prosecution that saw manipulation where others saw madness. And what if Pedro was telling the truth? What if this Cuban refugee, befriended by a kind teacher, really was innocent? The physical evidence was circumstantial, his admissions were partial, his mental state was questionable. Yet we killed him anyway. Or would God kill him if he had not? Pedro's botched execution became a catalyst for death penalty reform. Florida eventually abandoned the electric chair for lethal injection. Other states reconsidered their methods. His flaming death sparked conversations about humane execution, an oxymoron if there ever was one. In the end, Pedro Medina's legacy isn't just about a malfunctioning electric chair. It's about the intersection of immigration, mental illness, and capital punishment. It's about the price we pay when the system gets it wrong. And it's about a man who died as he lived, his final 15 years insisting on his innocence. If this story moved you, please smash that like button and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories just like this one.